The air is thick with tension as a crowd gathers in the shadow of towering stone temples, their eyes fixed on a chilling ritual that has been passed down through generations. The murmurs of priests and the beat of drums echo through the air as the scent of incense and blood fills the space. In the heart of these ancient civilizations, the blood of the innocent would be spilled, not for vengeance, but to appease the gods, to change the course of fate. It was a ritual born of fear, belief, and an insatiable need to control the unseen forces that governed life. Human sacrifice was not just a barbaric act, it was woven into the very fabric of ancient life. Across empires, from the majestic temples of the Aztecs to the sacred altars of the Celts, people believed that the gods demanded death to secure their favor, whether to win battles, ensure bountiful harvests, or bring prosperity. These societies believed that the offering of a human life could tip the balance of destiny. To refuse the gods was to invite disaster, for they were not merciful. They were vengeful, and their wrath could be fatal. In these societies, entire communities lived under the looming shadow of death. The rituals were not just a part of religious life. They were the cornerstone of power, the final plea for divine intervention in the face of war, famine, or disaster. The power of death, they believed, could alter the very course of their fate. Sacrifices were made not in fear of death alone, but in the hope that it would alter the heavens in their favor, ensuring that their lands would prosper, their kings would triumph, and their gods would protect them from the horrors of the world. As we journey through the brutal history of human sacrifice, we will uncover the horrifying truths behind these ancient rituals, how entire civilizations placed their faith in the killing of their own to change the course of destiny. These were not isolated acts, they were the cornerstone of belief, fear, and power in the ancient world. The Aztec Empire stands as one of the darkest chapters in the history of human sacrifice. For the Aztecs, blood was not just a symbol. It was the very lifeblood of their gods, and the offering of human hearts was seen as a divine necessity. The massive pyramids of the sun and moon, giant stone structures towering above the city of Tenochtitlan, became the stage for a gruesome spectacle that would unfold time and again. These pyramids were not just sacred sites, they were altars of death, where thousands of lives were ended in the name of appeasing the gods. At the heart of this terrifying practice was Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, whose power over the heavens and earth required an endless supply of blood. The Aztecs believed that without daily offerings of human sacrifice, the sun would not rise, plunging the world into darkness. It was believed that Huitzilopochtli fought off the forces of night and death every evening, only to rise again at dawn, renewed by the blood that was spilled in his honor. The Aztecs understood the sun's movement across the sky as a battle, and in this ritual of death, the fate of the world was decided. The victims of these terrifying rituals were often prisoners of war, captured, brought to Tenochtitlan to face their gruesome end. Once brought to the temple, they were stripped, bound, and led to the top of the pyramid. The high priests, dressed in intricate ceremonial robes, stood ready with obsidian blades, their hands stained in anticipation. The victim would be held down on a stone altar, their chest exposed to the crowd. Without hesitation, the priest would drive the obsidian blade deep into the victim's chest, piercing their heart while they were still alive. The beating heart would be torn from their body, held up to the gods as an offering. In some instances, the heart would be presented to the gods by the priest, and the body, still warm, would be thrown down the temple steps as the crowd erupted in both awe and horror. The blood, often splattered across the stone steps, served as a gruesome reminder of the power of the gods and the horrors that the Aztec people were willing to commit to maintain that power. The scale of the sacrifices was staggering. Historians believe that in some years, up to 20,000 people were sacrificed in a single year, each death a brutal act of worship meant to ensure the survival of the sun, the stability of the empire, and the favor of the gods. The Aztec priests were not concerned with the mercy of their victims. The ritual was a bloody show of power, meant to terrify the people into submission, as well as to demonstrate the might of the gods and the Aztec emperor, who was viewed as their earthly representative. This relentless cycle of death was not just a religious practice. It was a political tool. Through the fear and awe generated by these public executions, the Aztecs maintained control over their empire. The sheer number of sacrifices, the visceral gore, and the unrelenting violence painted the Aztec rulers as living gods, wielding the power to bring life or death with a single command. The sun rose every day, not through mercy, but through bloodshed, a constant offering to appease the wrathful gods. The Aztecs believed they lived in an eternal war between life and death, and the only way to tip the balance was to feed the gods with the blood of those who had been deemed unworthy of life. This horrifying, gruesome ritual was their truth, their power, and their terror. The Mayan civilization, one of the most advanced and mysterious cultures of the ancient world, shared a chilling belief that human sacrifice was essential to maintain the balance of the cosmos. The Maya, unlike the Aztecs, were not just offering blood for appeasement. They believed the gods needed their sacrifices to ensure rain, fertility, and prosperity, and to ward off the chaos that threatened the world. The Maya were obsessed with cosmic cycles, and in their eyes, blood was the currency that kept the universe in motion. Mayan kings and priests would often offer their own blood as part of these sacred rituals. A king, dressed in elaborate ceremonial robes, would cut his skin with sharp obsidian blades or pierce his tongue with a stingray spine, often in front of a crowd of onlookers. The blood that poured from his body was seen as a direct offering to the gods. The Maya believed that the blood of their rulers could communicate their devotion to the deities, ensuring the health of the land and the protection of the people. But this wasn't the only form of sacrifice that would be carried out. In times of great need, such as droughts, wars, or royal ceremonies, the Maya would perform gruesome sacrifices to appease the gods. The most common victims of these sacrificial rites were prisoners of war or captives. But young children were also considered the most sacred sacrifices. Children, seen as pure and innocent, were often selected for their perceived closeness to the gods. These victims were led to the temples, high stone platforms or pyramids, and there their fate was sealed. They would often be strangled, beheaded, or have their hearts cut out, offered up in a bloody display of devotion to the gods. One of the most unsettling aspects of Maya sacrifice was their use of cenotes, sacred natural wells, for drowning victims. These cenotes were seen as portals to the underworld, where the gods of rain and fertility dwelled. During ceremonial sacrifices, victims were cast into these deep, watery pits, often while still alive. The Maya believed that these cenotes were the perfect offering to the gods because of their mystical, otherworldly nature. Some of the bodies pulled from the cenotes during archaeological excavations show signs of violent death, but the water preserved them for centuries, turning them into eerily well-preserved relics of the sacrifice. These rituals were often performed during major events, such as the completion of a temple, the ascension of a king, or the victory in battle. The Maya saw these events as moments of cosmic importance, times when the gods would be watching, and sacrifices had to be made to keep the world in balance. Major temple constructions were often accompanied by a bloodletting ritual, in which both rulers and common people participated, offering their own blood to the gods. The act of bloodletting was symbolic. It demonstrated submission and loyalty to the gods, reinforcing the divine authority of the rulers. The ancient Maya believed they were constantly in a delicate balance with the gods, and that a single misstep could bring about cataclysmic consequences. Their world, governed by time cycles and celestial events, demanded constant offerings of life, especially in moments of crisis. To the Maya, the spilling of blood was not just a religious act, it was a cosmic necessity, a way to ensure that the forces of the universe remained in harmony, and that their crops would grow, their rains would fall, and their kings would remain in power. The Inca Empire, known for its remarkable achievements in agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, also shared a dark and chilling belief. Human sacrifice was an integral part of maintaining cosmic balance and ensuring the prosperity of their empire. While their sacrifices may not have been as frequent or large-scale as those of the Aztecs or Maya, the brutality and spiritual significance behind Incan sacrifices were no less chilling. At the heart of their sacrificial practices was the Capacocha ritual, an incredibly sacred and solemn event carried out during important times such as royal celebrations, the completion of monumental buildings, or even in times of crisis like war or natural disasters. In the Capacocha ritual, often from noble families, were chosen as the most precious and powerful offerings to the gods. These children, believed to be pure and closest to the gods, were seen as the most fitting sacrifices to ensure divine favor and prosperity for the empire. These chosen children were treated like royalty before their sacrifice. They were adorned in fine clothes, dressed in elaborate garments, and given jewelry made of gold and precious metals, symbols of their high status in society. They were honored and celebrated, as their role in the ritual was not seen as a punishment, but rather as a divine privilege. The Incas believed that the gods, especially Inti, the sun god, would favor the empire through the sacrificial offering of these innocent lives. Once the rituals began, the children were taken on a long, treacherous journey to the highest peaks of the Andes Mountains, where shrines and sacred sites were located. The mountaintop locations were chosen because they were closer to the gods, reaching into the heavens themselves. Here, the children would be presented at the sacred shrines, where the final act of sacrifice would occur. Before the sacrifice, the children were drugged, usually with chichas, a fermented corn beverage, or coca leaves, which served to numb them and ease their journey into the afterlife. This was not a quick death. The children were left in the freezing mountain air, their bodies slowly succumbing to the cold as they fell into an eternal sleep. The harsh Andean climate ensured their preservation for centuries, with their bodies often found perfectly mummified, becoming some of the most chilling relics of Incan history. These children were not merely killed. They were laid to rest in a ceremonial way, as if preparing them for eternal service to the gods. The freezing conditions of the high-altitude mountaintops provided an eerie, almost supernatural preservation of the bodies. Some of these mummies, with their eyes wide open and faces frozen in expressions of serenity, have been discovered hundreds of years later, still eerily intact despite their brutal deaths. The Capacocha sacrifices were seen as a means to communicate directly with the gods, ensuring that the land would be fertile, the sun would shine, and the harvests would thrive. By offering the purest, most innocent form of life, the Incas believed they would secure the divine favor needed to maintain the balance of life and death, prosperity and disaster. In the Incan worldview, the sun was the ultimate giver of life, and their actions were meant to maintain the natural order that allowed life to flourish. But in order for the sun to rise, the gods demanded a price: life itself, and more specifically, the sacrifice of innocence. These children were the ultimate symbol of purity and sacrifice, offering their very lives to ensure the health and prosperity of the Inca Empire. The Capacocha ritual serves as a haunting reminder of the lengths to which ancient civilizations were willing to go to appease their gods. It was not merely about sacrifice. It was about securing the future of the empire itself. cementing the belief that the gods could be influenced through the offerings of human lives. The brutality of these rituals, combined with the mysticism and spiritual reverence surrounding them, paints a chilling portrait of an empire that saw death as a means to eternal life, both for the sacrificed and for the kingdom they left behind. In the grand, inspiring world of ancient Egypt, human sacrifice was not as openly practiced as in the civilizations of the Americas. However, it was no less eerie or brutal. The Egyptians were deeply obsessed with the afterlife, believing that the transition from this world to the next was fraught with peril, requiring protection and guidance. Pharaohs, as divine rulers and intermediaries between gods and men, needed to be accompanied by their most loyal servants, even in death. But it was not simply an offering of goods or treasures. They needed living souls to serve them in the next world, ensuring their continued power and security after death. The rites of the pharaohs were steeped in ritual and mystery. It was believed that when a pharaoh died, they did not simply pass into oblivion. Instead, they were expected to continue their reign in the afterlife, where their power would be eternal. In this journey, the pharaoh's servants, often including concubines, advisors, and attendants, were expected to follow their ruler into the next life, ensuring their royal service would continue. These individuals, in the most gruesome sense, were often sacrificed, sometimes willingly, but often not. One of the most chilling aspects of this belief was the practice of sacrificial burials near royal tombs, especially in places like Abydos, a sacred burial ground of the Egyptian rulers. Abydos was thought to be the gateway to the afterlife, where the gods would judge the souls of the dead. It was here that evidence of human sacrifice has been found. Bodies buried alongside the pharaohs, some positioned as if they were still serving their masters in the afterlife. Servants and concubines would sometimes be chosen to accompany the pharaoh, not in life, but in death. These sacrifices were often deeply ceremonial, and while some were ritualistic, others were carried out through violent methods. Strangulation was one of the most common forms of sacrifice for these servants, as they were offered up to ensure their pharaoh's continued reign in the afterlife. In some instances, the bodies of the sacrificed were found arranged in ceremonial poses, symbolizing their continued servitude beyond death. The tombs at Abydos contain some of the most disturbing evidence of these practices. Archaeologists have unearthed mass graves, filled with the remains of individuals believed to have been sacrificed to serve their king in the next world. These bodies were often buried in the same crypts as the pharaohs, as if to symbolize their eternal bond. The unsettling detail in these burials is how some of the victims were alive when interred, left to suffocate or die in the darkness of the tomb. Others were strangled, their bodies preserved by the dry desert air, offering a gruesome but lasting testament to the eerie practices of the ancient Egyptians. In addition to these human sacrifices, animals were also buried with the pharaohs to accompany them on their journey to the afterlife. Dogs, cats, and horses were often buried in the same tombs, believed to provide companionship and protection to the king in the next life. But the human sacrifices were the most disturbing and chilling aspect of these rituals, reinforcing the idea that the pharaoh's power was so great, even death could not sever his control over others. These eerie sacrificial rituals were not reserved for pharaohs alone. High-ranking nobles, royal officials, and even the elite of Egyptian society sometimes saw their followers join them in death. The practice was a reflection of Egypt's worldview, that the afterlife was an extension of the earthly kingdom, and to ensure a smooth transition to that world, the dead required servants to attend them, even if it meant their lives had to be extinguished for the gods' approval. The silent sacrifices of ancient Egypt reveal a dark truth, one that speaks of a civilization so obsessed with eternity and the afterlife that it was willing to condemn its own people to brutal deaths, ensuring the immortal rule of its pharaohs. The tombs of Egypt are not only filled with treasures and riches, they are filled with the souls of those who were sacrificed to ensure the king's power lasted forever. Each death a reflection of the eternal bond between ruler and servant, both in life and beyond. The ancient Celts were a people whose spiritual life was deeply entwined with the forces of nature, and their rituals of sacrifice reflected their belief in the constant battle between life and death, fertility and destruction. Their connection to the land, the seasons, and the gods who governed them led them to practice rituals of human sacrifice as part of their complex spiritual and cultural worldview. The Celts, particularly their druidic priests, believed that their gods demanded blood to maintain balance and ensure fertility, prosperity, and good harvests. These sacrifices were not ceremonial events held in the open. They were dark, bloody rituals conducted in sacred groves, caves, and other secluded sites, where the natural world intersected with the divine. The gods, they believed, could only be appeased through the shedding of blood, and this was often done in ways that were as horrifying as they were spiritually significant. One of the most chilling and brutal practices involved the sacrifice of prisoners of war. The Celts had a deep tradition of warfare, and prisoners were often taken and offered to the gods in a horrific manner. These victims were sometimes thrown into sacred bogs, where they would sink into the muck and drown. The bogs themselves were seen as portals to the underworld, and the bodies that were cast into them were believed to appease the gods of fertility and harvest. These sacrificial rites were seen as ensuring a bountiful future, as the Celts believed that death in such a manner would please the gods and bring about fertile lands and abundant crops. The most gruesome and disturbing ritual, however, involved the construction of the wicker man. This giant effigy was made from wicker and filled with sacrifices, usually living prisoners, who were placed inside the man's hollow frame. The wicker man was then set ablaze, and as the flames consumed it, the victims inside were burned alive in a terrifying spectacle meant to invoke divine favor. The burning of the wicker man was often carried out during seasonal festivals, such as the Celtic festival of Beltane, when the Celts believed that fire was a powerful purifier that could cleanse the land and bring about rebirth and renewal. The sight of the wicker man burning, the screams of the victims trapped inside, and the smoke rising into the sky was a terrifying symbol of life and death intertwining. It was believed that by offering up these sacrifices in such a fiery, brutal manner, the gods would look favorably upon the tribe, ensuring the success of their crops and the prosperity of their people. The ritual was both a sacrifice to the gods and a grim form of divine communion, where fire, blood, and death fused together in a spiritual act that was seen as necessary for the survival of the community. The concept of the wicker man is perhaps one of the most iconic and horrifying aspects of Celtic sacrificial practices. The giant effigy, filled with living victims, was set ablaze to appease the gods in an act of terror and devotion. This ritual is an example of the extreme lengths the Celts were willing to go to ensure their survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The images of screaming, burning sacrifices in the belly of a wicker giant still haunt the imaginations of those who study Celtic rituals, a testament to the brutal relationship between life, death, and the gods that the Celts believed controlled their fates. These sacrificial rites, deeply rooted in the Celts' spiritual beliefs, served a dual purpose. They not only appeased the gods, but also acted as terrifying warnings to both the community and to their enemies. The rituals were public spectacles, designed to reinforce the power of the gods, the authority of the priests, and the dominance of the Celtic warriors. The chilling legacy of Celtic human sacrifice reflects a culture that saw the balance of life and death as fragile and ever-shifting. It was a people who believed that, in order to ensure prosperity and fertility, they had to offer life. And in the case of the wicker man, the most horrific and dramatic form of life was offered up in flames. The sacrifice was not just a gift to the gods. It was a statement of the Celts' belief that everything in life, from birth to harvest to death, was connected in a cycle of violence, sacrifice, and renewal. The Carthaginian Empire, a dominant force in the ancient Mediterranean, is known for many things: its powerful navy, its wealth, and its rivalry with Rome. However, one of the most chilling and brutal aspects of Carthaginian society was its practice of infant sacrifice. This was not merely an isolated or rare occurrence. It was deeply woven into their religious practices, a practice believed to ensure the favor of their gods, particularly Baal-Hamon, the god of fertility and prosperity. The Carthaginians believed that the gods demanded the purest form of life: newborns, infants, and young children, as the ultimate offering to ensure divine favor. The act of sacrificing infants was thought to secure fertility, ensure military victory, and bring prosperity to their people. To the Carthaginians, these sacrifices were not acts of cruelty, but rituals of devotion, intended to appease the gods, ensuring the survival and success of their empire in an uncertain world. The most notorious site linked to these practices is Tophet, a sacred sacrificial site discovered in modern-day Tunisia, the heart of Carthage. Excavations at Tophet have uncovered the remains of thousands of infants, buried in urns, suggesting that these young lives were offered up in death to appease the gods. The discovery of these mass graves paints a grim picture of religious devotion, one in which the lives of infants were sacrificed with the belief that their blood would bring about divine blessings. These children, often in the first stages of life, were placed in ceremonial urns and buried in a ritualistic manner, as part of an offering to the gods. The remains of the infants were often found with evidence of burning, suggesting that many were sacrificed by fire, adding a brutal layer to the practice. The Carthaginians didn't just kill the children, they burned them, believing that the flames purified their souls and carried their offerings to the gods. This method of burning victims alive, or offering them to the flames, was seen as the highest form of sacrifice. To the Carthaginians, these sacrifices were meant to give life and strength to their empire. By offering their most precious and innocent members of society, infants and children, they believed they could please Baal-Hamon, bringing prosperity, fertile lands, and military victories. The rituals of infant sacrifice were often performed during times of crisis, during wars, famines, or moments when the gods were believed to be displeased with the people. The Carthaginians believed that in moments of great danger or need, the gods required life to balance the world, and what better offering than the most vulnerable form of life: infants, who had not yet begun to live their lives fully. The practice continued for centuries, becoming a deeply ingrained part of Carthaginian religious life. Baal-Hamon, the primary god to whom these offerings were made, was associated with fertility, the sun, and agriculture, domains in which the Carthaginians had a deep vested interest. Given their dependence on crops and their constant battle for territorial dominance, archaeological evidence supports the widespread nature of these sacrifices. Tophet was not a single isolated site. It was a systematic burial ground, a place where these rituals were performed across the Carthaginian Empire. The mass graves of thousands of infants found there suggest that the practice was not just limited to rare occasions, but rather an institutionalized aspect of Carthaginian life, woven deeply into their culture. The practice of sacrificing infants to the gods to secure their favor is a chilling and disturbing reminder of the brutality of ancient civilizations. The Carthaginians believed that by offering their children to the gods, they could ensure the future of their people in both the physical and spiritual sense. The scale of these rituals, the mass graves, and the overwhelming evidence of infant remains make it clear that this practice was not just superstition. It was a central part of the Carthaginian worldview, where life and death were inextricably linked, and the offering of the purest, most innocent lives was believed to guarantee prosperity and success. This dark aspect of Carthaginian religion reveals a terrifying reality. In their desperate search for divine favor and survival, the Carthaginians were willing to offer up their own children, young, innocent, and vulnerable, as the ultimate sacrifice to their gods. The Tophet site stands today as a haunting testament to this brutal practice. Its mass graves a stark reminder of the sacrifices made in the name of faith, prosperity, and power. In the ancient world, where the gods were seen as both all-powerful and unpredictable, human sacrifice was practiced as a way to invoke divine favor in times of great need. Ancient Greece, known for its philosophical advancements and cultural legacy, also had a dark and tragic side when it came to appeasing the gods. Sacrifices, whether human or animal, were seen as a necessary means of ensuring victory in battle, securing prosperity, or ending plagues. The Greeks, like many ancient civilizations, believed that the gods demanded offerings, sometimes ultimate offering human lives. The practice of human sacrifice in Greece was typically reserved for times of extreme crisis, during wars, famines, or plagues, when the survival of the people or the success of military campaigns seemed uncertain. The gods, particularly powerful deities like Apollo, Zeus, and Artemis, were often believed to have the power to shift the tides of war, bring about good harvests, or stop the spread of disease. In exchange for their favor, the Greeks would offer what they held most precious, life itself. One of the most tragic and haunting examples of human sacrifice in Greek mythology is the story of Iphigenia, the daughter of the great king Agamemnon. According to the myth, when the Greek fleet was stranded at Aulis, unable to sail to Troy due to unfavorable winds, the oracle of Apollo declared that the only way to appease the god and allow the fleet to sail was for Agamemnon to sacrifice his own daughter. Torn between his duty as a father and as a leader, Agamemnon ultimately decided to offer Iphigenia to the gods in exchange for favorable winds. Iphigenia, unaware of her fate, was brought to the altar where she would be sacrificed. In some versions of the myth, at the last moment, Artemis intervened, sparing Iphigenia and replacing her with a deer to be sacrificed instead. But the reality of the story, the idea that a father could sacrifice his own daughter for the greater good of his people, remains a haunting reflection of the ancient world's willingness to trade human life for divine favor. It symbolizes the belief that the gods could demand even the life of a loved one, no matter the personal cost, to secure victory and prosperity for the greater whole. The sacrifice of Iphigenia became a symbol of the tragic legacy of sacrifice in Greek culture, where loyalty to the gods and the state could outweigh the most sacred of personal bonds. It revealed the brutal reality that in times of war or crisis, the gods demanded submission and the offering of the most innocent, even if it meant the destruction of the most precious human relationships. While the sacrifice of Iphigenia is perhaps the most iconic, it wasn't an isolated incident. In times of plague, living human sacrifices were sometimes performed to appease gods like Apollo and Zeus. Plague sacrifices were made in the belief that the gods were punishing the people for offenses, and only through the blood of a human offering could the disease be lifted. Victims, often criminals or volunteers, were offered to the gods, their deaths believed to purify the land and end the suffering of the people. Sacrifices were performed in temples, altars, and sacred sites throughout Greece, and while many of the rituals involved animal sacrifices, humans were not considered beyond the reach of the gods' demands. The gods' power over the lives of mortals was seen as absolute, and to disobey them meant wrath, which could come in the form of disease, military defeat, or famine. The tragic fate of Iphigenia, the offering of other victims during times of plague, and the constant threat of divine retribution for displeasing the gods marked ancient Greek religion with a dark undercurrent of fear and violence. The tragic legacy of human sacrifice in ancient Greece speaks to the brutal realities of a world where the favor of the gods was believed to shape every aspect of life, from military campaigns to agricultural success. The sacrifices were a stark reminder that in this ancient world, the gods demanded power over life and death, and the willingness to offer human lives was seen as the ultimate act of devotion and submission to their will. Across ancient civilizations, the horror of human sacrifice was not simply about appeasing capricious gods. It was a brutal manifestation of a deeper, more pervasive belief that life and death were inextricably tied to the fate of entire empires. The act of sacrificing human beings was a display of power, an unrelenting message of dominance and control. For these ancient cultures, death was not merely an end. It was a tool, an offering, a currency to bend the gods to their will and to maintain the delicate balance between life and destruction. Whether it was the Aztecs sacrificing prisoners to Huitzilopochtli, the Maya offering children to the gods of rain, or the Carthaginians sacrificing infants to Baal Hammon, these rituals shared a terrifying purpose: to assert dominance over the natural world and to manipulate divine forces. The gods were not just worshipped, they were feared. And this fear was used to control populations, to maintain order, and to ensure survival. Human sacrifice was an instrument of power, a method of forcing the gods into submission and ensuring that the ruling elite retained control over both the people and the land. But beyond the physical brutality of these sacrifices lay a psychological warfare. Fear was the driving force behind the rituals. Fear of the gods, fear of death, and the deep-seated belief that the afterlife was as much a part of their rule as the earthly kingdom they commanded. To the rulers of these civilizations, death was not to be feared, it was to be controlled. They believed that their connection to the divine was absolute, and they wielded this belief to dominate the populace. By offering human lives to the gods, they demonstrated their power to both the people and the deities, ensuring that their rule would continue unchallenged. The gods were seen as omnipotent beings whose wrath could bring devastation to the land: plague, famine, drought, or war. This fear of divine retribution was manipulated by the rulers to create a sense of divine inevitability. If a ruler could claim to speak for the gods, then their decisions were not simply political. They were divinely mandated. The psychological impact of this was profound. People lived in constant fear, not just of the rulers, but of the gods' displeasure. The notion that disobedience would be punished not by a mere human hand, but by the wrath of omnipotent deities, created a culture of fear that permeated every aspect of life. The grandeur of these civilizations, their majestic temples, towering pyramids, and monumental cities, was overshadowed by the terror that underpinned their power. The vastness of their empires, the wealth, and the artistic achievements were all achieved through the constant fear of divine retribution and the willingness to sacrifice life itself to maintain that grandeur. What is striking, however, is the dichotomy between their opulence and the brutal means they employed to secure their prosperity. A grand temple might be dedicated to a god of fertility, while thousands of lives were sacrificed in its shadow, their blood spilled to ensure that the kingdoms thrived. In many ways, these empires were built on a paradox: the gods demanded death to ensure life, and in offering death, these civilizations reaffirmed their dominion over the natural world. The rulers, surrounded by wealth and opulence, were not just political figures, they were intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. Their decisions to sacrifice were not simply religious, they were also political statements. a constant reminder to the people of their inherent power and the severe consequences of disobedience. A terror that these rulers invoked went beyond the physical violence of sacrifice. It was psychological, rooted in the existential fear of death and the unknown. To question the rulers was to question the gods, and to defy the gods could bring swift and irreversible punishment. This system of power through fear is what allowed these ancient empires to maintain dominance over vast populations for centuries. The gods were not merely believed in. They were used as tools of control, ensuring that the ruler's power was absolute. In the end, the horror of sacrifice was not just about the death of the individual, but the fear of death itself that governed entire civilizations. It was a brutal reminder that in these ancient worlds, power was not only secured by wealth and might. It was earned through the blood of the sacrificed, who were offered as a means to ensure the gods' favor and keep the fragile balance between life and death in check. These civilizations, magnificent in their grandeur, were also built on a foundation of terror, where the power of the rulers was not just absolute in the physical world, but in the realm of the divine as well. The history of human sacrifice is a chilling testament to the lengths ancient civilizations were willing to go to in their pursuit of power, control, and divine favor. Empires were built on the fear of death and the gods, with rulers leveraging these rituals to assert their dominance and secure their rule. The bloodshed, once a means to appease the gods, has left a dark legacy, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty in the name of survival and supremacy. Today, these practices are remembered not just as brutal acts, but as reflections of the terrifying extremes to which societies have gone to manipulate fate and maintain control. The echoes of those ancient sacrifices remind us of the fragile nature of power and the price paid by those who were forced to give their lives to ensure that others might thrive. History is dark, and we must remember it.